This episode of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is brought to you by the new book Spaceman by Mike Massimino. Publishers Weekly writes, readers will be delighted and moved by retired astronaut Massimino's almost childlike wonder and enthusiasm, coupled with his humility. This is an engaging and uplifting memoir that's sure to give readers a deeper appreciation for the U.S. space program and inspire some future astronauts. Learn more at MikeMassimino.com.
Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 225 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is book critic Ruth Franklin. She's a frequent contributor to The New Yorker and Harper's, and is a recipient of a New York Public Library Cullman Fellowship and a Guggenheim Fellowship. And we'll be speaking with her today about her new book, Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life, which explores how Jackson came to write such classic tales as The Lottery, The Haunting of Hill House, and We Have Always Lived in the Castle. And today's show is brought to you by Spaceman, the new memoir by NASA astronaut Mike Massimino. And here's Mike's bio. It says, Mike Massimino served as a NASA astronaut from 1996 to 2014. A veteran of 2 space flights to the Hubble Space Telescope, Mike and his crews set team records for spacewalking time, and he became the first person to tweet from space. He's played himself on the CBS sitcom The Big Bang Theory, was featured in the IMAX film Hubble 3D, and has appeared on talk shows such as The Late Show with David Letterman and Good Morning America. And here's a bit more about Mike's reaction to seeing the Earth from space for the first time. He writes, according to my suit's biometric sensors, I have a normal resting heart rate of 50 or 60 beats per minute. The moment I saw the Earth, it spiked to 120. The thought that entered my head was, this is something I'm not supposed to see. This is a secret. The planet below was so beautiful that I actually started getting emotional. I had to look away. I was afraid I was going to tear up, and if you get water floating around in your suit, that could be a big problem. There would be a post-flight investigation, and I would have to admit that I was crying in space. I also like this quote about the Hubble. Mike writes, understanding what's happening at the other end of the galaxy is a path to understanding ourselves, understanding who we are and why we're here. That's why we go. The beauty of Hubble is that it is maybe the purest expression of that idea that exists today. Not only is it an instrument that can see farther and deeper into the history of the universe than any other machine ever built, the knowledge that it provides belongs to everyone. It's done solely for the enrichment of our fellow man, and that's an incredible thing. The book has received a starred review from Kirkus, and Bill Nye the Science Guy writes, inspired by moonwalkers, Mike grew up, became an astronaut, and fixed the Hubble Space Telescope, all while remaining some kind of humble. You can't help but follow him from Long Island to the bottom of the spacewalk practice pool, then 350 miles up and back. He's a spaceman through and through, and he tells how hard work can take you out of this world. So the book is called Spaceman, an astronaut's unlikely journey to unlock the secrets of the universe, and you can learn more at MikeMassimino.com. And now let's get to our interview. All right, so we're here with Ruth Franklin. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so how did you first get interested in Shirley Jackson?
Well, it's hard to say. I guess in some ways she was always kind of there in the background. I had read The Lottery at some point. I don't even remember exactly when. But The Haunting of Hill House, her famous ghost story novel, has always been one of my favorite books. But it wasn't actually until around 6 years ago when I started reading more widely in her work and got a sense of how wide her range is that I became interested in telling the story of her life.
So was there anything in particular that prompted you to go read more of her work?
Well, in 2010, the Library of America came out with a big edition that included a lot of her short stories, as well as The Haunting of Hill House and her great last novel, We Have Always Lived in the Castle. And, I was reading that book. Actually, there's one story in it. It's actually more of an essay because Jackson also wrote these autobiographical memoirs about her life as a housewife and mother of 4 children and wife to her absent-minded professor husband, Stanley Edgar Hyman. So she wrote this essay called The Third Baby's the Easiest. And in it, she tells the story of going to the hospital to deliver her 3rd child. And the clerk asks her to state her profession. And she says, writer. And the clerk says, I'll just put down housewife. So when I read the story, I felt like this just encapsulates so much about just what it meant to be a woman like Shirley Jackson, to be a writer and a mother at the same time at this moment, this moment in America, the late 1940s, 1950s, when this was a really unusual choice for a woman. And I wanted to learn more about how she was able to make that happen.
So did you have an idea to write a biography at that point, or did that come later?
I had been thinking about writing a biography for some time, just because as a book critic, I'm always really interested in the stories behind how books come into being. And so I'm always kind of looking to tell those stories in my book reviews as best as I can. So I was sort of, I guess, a biographer in search of a subject. And then everything kind of came together for me in Shirley Jackson.
And so kind of what was your first step then when you decided to write this biography?
Well, my first step was to take a look and see how much material was available. I mean, I guess I would say this is all part of the decision-making process in terms of settling on the decision to write the biography. So I knew there had been a previous biography published towards the end of the 80s, and I read it and felt that, in many ways it's a very good book, and in others it's kind of incomplete in that it doesn't really tell the story of Jackson's evolution as a writer. It focuses much more on her personal life, and her creative life was the aspect of her persona that I was most interested in. And so then I went and had a look at her archives, which are kept at the Library of Congress, just to see, how much material was there, how rich it was. And, so I was thrilled to discover not only that there was just tons of material there, more than 50 boxes worth of papers, notebooks, drawings, photographs, all kinds of stuff. But also that there was a lot of new archival material that had not been available to the previous biographer, much of it shedding light on Jackson's marriage, often a complicated marriage, to Stanley Edgar Hyman. And then, of course, in the course of the project, through my contacts with sources and other people, I was able to find even more material that hadn't been seen before. But I would say that was really the most important step in the process, was actually to see the material, to see what was there, and the realization that there was a new way to tell Jackson's story with a lot of new information.
So were you able to read 50 boxes worth of material?
In the beginning, I definitely had as a goal the idea that I would leave no piece of paper unturned. And as the years went on, it became clear that goal might not be entirely realistic. And, you start skipping over things like, Dear Miss Jackson, the Montpelier Ladies Society is writing to confirm your engagement for Tuesday the 20th at 12 o'clock noon. In the beginning, everything seems like, even stuff like that, everything seems like it could potentially somehow be important to your story. And a lot of times, I made notes on things that were totally obscure to me at the time, that later something would jog my memory and I would understand what they were about. And so, that made me really anxious about the idea of skipping over anything because you just, never know what might someday seem important. And in fact, there was a lot of, material that might have seemed trivial that I did go through very carefully. For instance, all of Jackson's dialogues are preserved in her archive, these notebooks in which she kept track of her daily menus during the periods when she was trying to lose weight. And, since she was in fact quite overweight at different points of her life, this accounts for years worth of material. And so she kept track of her meals and the calories consumed, and also of the number of cocktails she drank. And, this information seems superficial on the one hand, but it's a kind of a roadmap of her preoccupations.
So you said as the years go by, how long did you spend working on this book?
From start to finish, it was about 6 years.
Wow.
Which in biography land isn't that crazy. I know people who have had biographies that took 20 years. So that was my goal.
In Stanley Hyman land, it's not too long, too, right?
Indeed. But the land of the working writer, who needs to needs to have a source of income. Things can't be allowed to drag on forever.
Yeah. Okay, well, so tell us a little bit about her life. You start off the book with this quote where an interviewer asks her, was she encouraged by her family to write? And she responds, "They couldn't stop me."
Isn't that wonderful? Yeah, so Jackson was born into a family where she really seems to have been the black sheep or the misfit. Her mother was kind of a classic socialite. And one of my favorite discoveries in the archive, actually, was a diary, or rather just a notebook, that had on its cover the picture of a very demure young woman with curls, I think in some kind of silk dress, maybe with pearls on. And the title of the picture written underneath was The Debutante. And someone, I'm assuming it was Jackson, I can't obviously say for sure, but someone had taken a pencil and scratched out the face of this woman. And, that seemed to me to say so much about what Shirley Jackson as a teenager thought of her mother's aspirations for her to become a debutante, in her mother's socialite mode. It just wasn't something she was ever interested in at all. She had a younger brother who fit into that scene much better. And in fact, I interviewed a friend of his who, the child of a friend of his, actually, whose mother had remembered Shirley's brother saying, "Oh, well, we never can imagine what we're going to do with Shirley. What are we going to do with Shirley in the end?" She just, from the very beginning, she always went her own way. And her mother was extremely critical of this tendency when she was a teenager. And it was a criticism that continued throughout her life. In Jackson's archives, she's got folder after folder of letters from her mother, and they're often written in the most belittling, carping tone, criticizing her for things like not acknowledging a gift on time, as an adult. There was one amazing one written after one of Shirley Jackson's daughters, as a teenager, spent a summer in California with her grandparents, because that's where Shirley Jackson actually was from. She spent her childhood in Burlingame, California, then as now a very wealthy suburb of San Francisco. Then her family moved east when she was in high school, just towards at the end of her high school years, which I think was quite a shock for her. She hated the Northeast at first. She hated the weather and the cold and all that. And so I think, she would have been probably the most surprised person to know that eventually she would become identified as a New England writer and spend most of her days in Vermont, which I'm sure would have seemed very uncongenial to the teenager who longed for the California sunshine and, the avocados and the pomegranates and all that. She remembered with a lot of fondness. But as I was saying, she, as much later, she sent her teenage daughter to visit her grandparents in California for the summer. And this just shows how, mean a person Shirley's mother was. After the visit, she sent Shirley an itemized bill of all the money she had spent on her granddaughter. Every little thing she had bought her, from a bathing suit to, I don't know what. And Shirley sent her a check.
Wow. I also want to mention that Shirley didn't fit in with her parents because they were Christian Scientists, and she was not too into that. She actually says that she said at one point that her grandmother had, quote unquote, died of Christian Science. Yeah,
as an adult, she always was very, very skeptical of the way she had been brought up, and would tell her children stories about the practices that her grandmother and also her mother, I won't say indulged in, but, that they carried out. Her grandmother was actually a Christian Science faith healer who practiced healing, literally hung up a shingle at the Jackson family home when Shirley was growing up. So it's amazing to think that that's what she was exposed to as a child. And she would tell this story about how she felt terribly guilty about this, that when they were children, she had teased her brother and kind of goaded him into running very fast down a hill. He had fallen and broken his arm because of this. And her mother and grandmother, instead of taking him immediately to the hospital, spent the whole night praying over it. And it was a source of guilt and pain for Shirley, that not only that she had caused this accident, but that her brother hadn't been given adequate medical treatment right away.
Yeah. Okay, so then she goes off to college, and you mentioned that she meets this guy, Stanley Hyman, who she ends up marrying. And there's a really interesting story about how they meet. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so Stanley Hyman, they met at Syracuse University, then is now a popular school for people who wanted to go into journalism. And that's definitely how Stanley Hyman identified himself at a very early age. He decided that he wanted to be a critic when he was still in high school, and went to Syracuse. And then one day during his sophomore year, he picked up a college literary magazine that had been produced by Shirley's creative writing class. And the story goes that he flipped through the magazine and said that just about everything was in it was junk. But he settled on one story that was really interesting. And after he read it, he declared that he was going to marry its author. Unfortunately, all the principals are no longer alive to verify the accuracy of this story, but it is the legend that has grown up around their meeting. And in fact, that was very much the dynamic of their relationship, especially in the early days. Stanley saw himself as the great critic who was going to kind of work in symbiosis with Shirley's creative genius and explain her work to the world and even to herself, because he was convinced that she didn't really think about it in an intellectual way. She just kind of spilled it all out and left it there for him to interpret.
Right, and so she was really captivated by the possibility of living the life of the mind with him, but he was also Jewish, which I guess at that time was kind of an issue.
Yeah, it was kind of an issue. Jackson's parents, in addition to her mother being Christian Scientists, they were, I guess, your kind of classic upper crust anti-Semites of that era. And they were extremely unhappy about the idea of their daughters dating a Jew. And of course, Stanley's parents weren't any happier about it either. I mean, they met in 1938, just before World War II. Reports of, Kristallnacht were just coming out of Europe around the time they met. And Stanley's father, in fact, didn't speak to him for several years after the two of them were married. Their relationship was so controversial that Shirley didn't even tell her parents that they were going to get married, and in fact didn't confess to it until a couple years later when she was pregnant with their first child. One of their children told me that in fact it took 20 years or so before Shirley's parents found out what their real wedding anniversary was. Up until then, they were always sending gifts at the wrong time.
Well, yeah, no, it's really shocking today to go back and read what college life was like at the time. You say that few fraternities admitted Jews and the black students weren't even allowed to live on campus. It's just... Yeah,
and this was at a relatively liberal university like Syracuse. It's hard to imagine how much worse it must have been elsewhere. I mean, remember, this also was an era, when hotels openly advertised that they were restricted, obviously restricted from Jews and from blacks. And especially racism was an issue that always energized both Shirley and Stanley. Starting from the time that they were in college, they wrote an editorial in the literary magazine that they created, a couple editorials actually fulminating against the situation for black students on campus. That the black students weren't at the time allowed to live in the Syracuse dormitories. In terms of anti-Semitism, I think it was less obvious than the racism, but still, very much kind of underneath the surfaces of people's politeness. Shirley definitely was exposed to comments from friends of hers of, about how could she possibly date a Jew. And, it was something that she felt very keenly about. She really identified with Stanley as an outsider and as the subject of prejudice, because, growing up the way she did, in the town and with the parents she had, she always felt like an outsider herself. And so I think she really identified with this aspect of his character and completely took on that aspect of his identity. I'm not saying in a religious sense, because Stanley wasn't a religious Jew at all, although he was brought up traditionally. He would later say that he became an avowed atheist, I think at the age of 14 or something like that. But culturally, he did identify as Jewish, and Shirley, in her private life, took the last name Hyman. The children had the last name Hyman, which, marked them as a Jewish family, which in the town of North Bennington, Vermont, where they ended up, was obviously a very unusual thing to be.
Right, yeah, so they get married and they move to North Bennington because Stanley has a teaching job there. And there's this incident too I wanted to mention where they have all these they have this big book collection, and the movers are moving the books into the house, and they drop one of the boxes, and it splits open, and there's all this communist literature inside.
Yeah. I thought that was a really incredible story. So just to unpack things a little bit, that happened, they moved to North Bennington. Stanley had been offered a teaching job at Bennington College, which at the time was considered one of the most radical campuses in America, a very progressive, independent women's college that was founded on the idea of providing a new kind of education for women that was going to really allow themselves to develop creatively. And it was full of people like Stanley Hyman who didn't have advanced degrees, but were practitioners of the art that they taught, painters and musicians. And Stanley, of course, is a literary critic, and many other writers there. But unfortunately, he was fired after his first year or so there. And he and Shirley decided to move to Westport, Connecticut, which didn't wind up not lasting very long. But it was on the move to Westport that there was this incident where the carton of books broke open. And so one of their former neighbors told me that when the moving truck came for Shirley and Stanley's stuff, their books took up an entire moving truck. At that point, they probably had around 10,000 books. And it's hard to say how many books were eventually in their collection when they died, but it was probably between 25,000 and 30,000. Just an amazing number. And, remember, Stanley was a book critic, and he got a lot of these for free. But he also was a huge collector of rare and, specialty academic books, especially in the field of folklore criticism, folklore and mythology, which became his academic specialty. So, as part of the research, I filed a FOIA request for Stanley's FBI file because he had been involved with the YCL, the Young Communist League, while they were at Syracuse. Shirley was never really involved. She was basically uninterested in politics for her entire life. But I knew that Stanley had been involved, and so I requested his FBI file because I was hoping to fill in some gaps about his activities during those college years. And what I found, actually was astounding. There was nothing about his college years, but what I found was documentation of an investigation the FBI had undertaken of him, and as a side note, also of Shirley, from around 1948 until the early 50s. Just obviously just at the time of the beginning of the Red Scare in America. And what triggered this investigation, according to the FBI file, and I still am not 100% certain whether this story is the truth or it's some kind of cover-up, but according to the FBI file, the investigation was triggered because one of the cartons of books fell off this moving truck and the mover happened to notice that it was filled with communist material and reported it to the local FBI office. And in fact, part of the reason the FBI became interested in Stanley as a target was because the neighbors reported that he had so many books. There's so many books in the house that the FBI thought that it might be a storehouse of communist material. Of course, it wasn't. It was simply the library of two incredibly well-read and intellectually curious people.
Yeah, but so basically throughout their lives they had problems with the neighbors, and that's a constant theme. And that leads obviously Shirley to write her famous story, The Lottery. So tell us about how that story came about.
Right. Yeah, problems with the neighbors. I think it's so ironic to learn that the author of The Lottery, in fact, was spied on by her neighbors who, reported her activities to the FBI, which she may or may not have been aware of at the time. But, backing up The Lottery, she told a lot of stories about the origin of the lottery. And it boils down to she was out shopping for groceries one morning with one of her young children, who was about, I think, 2 or 2.5 at the time. And she would say that on her way back home, she had the idea for the story. And it was maybe the walk up the hill to their house. They lived up a very steep hill at the time, that put an edge to it. And as soon as they got home, she put the baby in the playpen and put away her groceries and immediately sat down to write this story. And she was finished before her older son came home from kindergarten for lunch. So it's just amazing to think that, this story that has become such a staple of American culture was written by its author in just a few hours.
Right. And so you mentioned that, that it's become this staple of American culture. Talk a little bit about what the response was to the story when it was published.
Yeah, I mean, people definitely didn't assume at once that it was going to be this, become the kind of classic that it became. As Shirley's editor at The New Yorker called it, a classic in some category. And that pretty much sums it up. People were not sure at all what to make of The Lottery. The New Yorker said at the time that it generated more letters than the magazine had ever before received for a work of fiction. And Jackson loved to talk about these letters in a lecture that she often gave about the writing of The Lottery. And she emphasized how vicious they were, that she got all this hate mail. People called her names, and they canceled their subscriptions. And, she wasn't exaggerating about these letters. She received hundreds of them and saved them in a big scrapbook that anyone can go see in her archive at the Library of Congress. But what I found when I went through them was that they weren't as angry as she made them out to be. Mostly, they were confused. People were really and truly disturbed by the lottery, and so distressed that they felt called upon to write into the magazine for an answer to this burning question they felt of what on earth does this story mean?
Yeah, I mean, this quote really jumped out at me. She says, "If the letter writers could be considered to give any accurate cross-section of the reading public, I would stop writing now."
Yeah.
And she didn't even know about the internet.
Indeed. This is kind of an early version of the comments section, it seems like. Totally unmoderated and unfiltered.
Yeah. And it never really occurred to me before how her neighbors must have felt reading The Lottery, but they were not amused.
They were not amused. It's funny. I'm not sure how many of her neighbors actually read The Lottery. I interviewed one person, the shopkeeper, whose grocery store called Powers Market is a landmark in the village of North Bennington. The market was run by his father, and he worked in it as a young man around the time that Jackson wrote The Lottery. And so I interviewed him a few years ago, and he was very elderly. He's since passed away. And he swore to me that he had never read the story. the most famous story ever to be written in his hometown, and he insisted that he had never read it. And, I think that was the reaction of many of the townspeople was that, this was something that belonged to the realm of the New Yorker and wasn't really a part of their culture, just like Shirley Jackson, despite living in the town for, almost 20 years, would never really become accepted among the villagers. She and Stanley were always treated as outsiders. And, I don't think this wasn't necessarily personal. Any newcomer would have been treated the same way. Bernard Malamud, another Jew who was a professor at Bennington College and lived in town, told a story of once referring to somebody he knew in the town as a local, and was sternly rebuked because it turned out that this man, who was apparently an octogenarian at the time, had been born somewhere else and had moved to North Bennington as a child. So he couldn't really be considered a local. So, you can imagine how Shirley and Stanley, and then, of course, also the Malamuds, must have felt. I have the sense that it truly was very difficult to integrate oneself in a community like this.
Yeah. Okay, so the lottery gets published, and it's this big sensation, but that actually starts causing problems in Shirley and Stanley's marriage. So tell us about that.
Right. This made me feel actually very sorry for Stanley. He spent most of the 1940s, he spent working on a gigantic tome of literary criticism. It was called The Armed Vision, and it aimed to look at, I think, 12 different representative critics and their approaches, and eventually synthesize them all into the perfect critic. So basically, it was a criticism of criticism. And Stanley, was very ambitious for this book and really thought that it was going to launch his career as a great literary critic. And he delayed and had trouble finishing it because of his teaching, which he was sort of unprepared for. And so the book, which I think was originally supposed to come out in 1945, ended up coming out just a couple weeks before the lottery in the summer of 1948. And unfortunately, as I don't have to tell you or your listeners who have never heard of this book, it did not cause the kind of sensation that Stanley had been hoping for. And in fact, it got some rather negative reviews. And part of the problem with this book, looking at it now, it's impossible to imagine how it could have gotten anything other than negative reviews, because Stanley was so harsh on all these critics who were necessarily going to be the people called upon to review this book. And his editor actually foresaw this problem when he was trying to get blurbs for it, and was turned down by many of the people he asked because Stanley had insulted them at one point or another in print. If not actually in this book itself, which did happen on a few occasions, then in some review that he had written. So he had already made himself a number of enemies by the time the book came out, and he was crushed by its poor reception, and also by the fact that it didn't sell very many copies. It was a time when he and Shirley dearly needed the money. Now, fortunately, the lottery came along and cemented Shirley's reputation, and from that point on, her fees for stories, increased dramatically, to the extent that within a few years, she was going to be the family's breadwinner. Again, an extremely unusual role for a woman of her period. But it's kind of sad to see that, as her trajectory, was on the upswing, his started heading down at that point. And, he didn't actually publish another book for more than a decade. He was so demoralized by this experience.
I mean, one thing that really struck me reading this was how often you compare the work of Shirley Jackson to Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique about a decade later.
Mm.
Could you talk about why you felt it was so important to emphasize those connections?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that Shirley Jackson was a feminist, which is a question that I often get, because it simply wasn't a word that she would have used, or that most people would have used in with anything like the meaning that we give to it now. But what she was concerned to do in her work was to tell the stories of women. And looking at her body of work, what's extremely striking is that virtually all of it is focused around women. You can literally count on one hand the number of male protagonists of her stories. And I think this is part of the reason that she didn't win the kind of acceptance that she deserved in her time. But it's also what makes her writing feel so prescient, is that a good decade before Friedan would come out with The Feminine Mystique, Jackson was already writing the story that she was going to tell about the dissatisfaction of the housewife, who feels this strange stirring of discontent within herself and doesn't have the ability to give it a name. But this tension that underlies her work is the tension that the women of her time felt in struggling to meet the standards, to be the perfect housewife, and yet feeling that there was obviously that there was something else out there that they were destined to do.
Right, and so she wrote a lot about women, and she also wrote a lot about houses, which is understandable if you're a housewife. Could you just talk about her connection to houses and how houses show up in her work?
Yeah, she was always, they were always a major preoccupation of hers. You could even say that it was kind of in her blood because she came from a family of architects. Her great-great-grandfather was one of the first architects in San Francisco before the earthquake, which destroyed, unfortunately, a lot of his creations. And then some of his descendants also became architects. And houses were just a major interest of hers throughout her life. She collected pictures of them and postcards. And her work always includes really careful descriptions of the rooms where important scenes take place. And then, in her later career, her three last completed novels, The Sundial, The Haunting of Hill House, and We Have Always Lived in the Castle, each of these works revolves around a house that becomes almost a kind of character in the novel itself.
Well, right. I mean, The Haunting of Hill House, I think, is probably her best known work after The Lottery. And could you talk about how did that story exactly come about?
It's interesting. I think she had in her mind that she wanted to write a ghost story, that not a traditional ghost story, but that she was interested in the notion of psychical investigation and research, and the idea of whether it could be proved whether ghosts were real or not. She always expressed skepticism about it, but whether she truly believed in ghosts or not, I think, is difficult to say. But it was important for the novel that the ghosts exist primarily on a psychological level. She never gives it away in the novel, whether the supernatural manifestations are real or are the projections of the psyche of Eleanor, the main character, who it becomes clear throughout the novel that she is quite unstable. But the premise of the novel is that there's a psychical researcher named Dr. Montague who decides to undertake an investigation of Hill House, around which all kinds of legends have sprung up. And so he invites a group of people who have some kind of psychic incident in their background to join him in this investigation, and only a few of them respond. And those become the characters who we follow through the novel as they themselves report on what they observe taking place in the house and puzzle over whether it's truly supernatural or not.
Right, and I think she herself was having sort of psychological disturbances, right? I mean, the origin of the story, right, was that she was she took the train into New York City, and she saw this abandoned tenement and was so disturbed by it that she couldn't get it out of her mind and fled the city and things like that.
Yeah, it's a strange story. She describes, as you say, taking a train to New York and just catching a glimpse out of the corner of her eye of a burned out apartment building. And she finds something deeply evil about the building, and it shakes her up in kind of a profound way, so that when she returns to Vermont, she becomes kind of obsessed with the idea of writing a novel about a haunted house, and kind of goes around searching for one. In fact, one of her children told me about going on long drives with her throughout the countryside, where they would look for abandoned houses. And in fact, there were a lot of potential houses that might have served as the model for the house in Hill House. There's a story that one of the buildings on the Bennington College campus was called Jennings Hall, was meant to be the model. I can't tell you how many people have told me with great authority that, oh yes, Jennings Hall is the model for Hill House. And there's no evidence for this whatsoever. There's nothing about it in her files. In fact, she would say that she didn't like the New England houses that are all kind of square angles, and no ghost would dream of haunting them. She actually looked towards her childhood and asked her mother for some pictures of houses that her ancestors had created. She liked what she called these big old California gingerbread houses, old Victorians with lots of turrets and gables and all kinds of odd angles. And she was really interested in the Winchester Mystery House, which you might have heard of out in California, which is not far from Burlingame, where she grew up. It was the house belonging to the widow of the man who created the Winchester Rifle Company. And the story goes that she was haunted by the guilt of thinking of all the people who had been killed by these guns. I guess, she was an early proponent of gun control. And the story goes that she had this house built. She consulted a psychic or something like that, who told her that the only way to rid herself of this haunting was to build a house that would be really confusing to all the ghosts, and a house that would be constantly in flux. So apparently she hired a whole bunch of carpenters and all kinds of workers to just work on the house indefinitely for decades until she died. And apparently it's a big tourist attraction today. I haven't been to it, but you can go on tours of this house, and indeed it's apparently full of all kinds of odd angles and, super narrow hallways and staircases that don't go anywhere. And it definitely is one of the houses that she thought about during the time that she was writing Hill House. She wrote to her mother and asked for information about the Winchester house. But I had kind of a funny experience when I was spending time in Bennington, Vermont a couple summers ago, around a mansion just a few miles away from where Jackson lived called the Everett Mansion, which it turns out has some strange stories around it, too, that are kind of reminiscent of the stories that Jackson incorporated into Hill House about the family that built the house. And some physical similarities convinced me that house may also have been among her models. And in fact, there was a picture of it in her files.
I'm sorry, did you say you had a strange experience there?
I did have kind of a strange experience there, where I went for a walk around the grounds. It's now part of Southern Vermont College. And without knowing it was there, I went out for a walk one afternoon, and there was a big field with a hill, and the hill was covered with really, really tall grass. And as I was walking through the grass, I had kind of a flashback to a scene in Hill House where she describes the grass waving in the breeze as if an animal of some kind is walking through it. And this scene just flashed into my mind, and there are woods beyond it, and I just had this feeling that I did not want to proceed any farther in that direction. And I turned around and went down a different path, and I was just stunned when I came out of this path into a clearing, and I saw the back of this house, which I recognized from the picture that I had seen of it in Jackson's files. It truly felt as if I had somehow been there before. And so I realized that, what had frightened me out there in the grass, wasn't some kind of supernatural experience, but, if in fact this was part of what Jackson modeled the house and grounds in the novel on, then perhaps I recognized it simply from having read the novel so many times and, kind of incorporated it into my own, imagination and, personal mythology.
Huh. Wow, that's really interesting. I mean, I read The Haunting of Hill House. I was just out of college when I read it. And the scene that has always stuck with me the most is this scene where Eleanor is in bed at night and she's scared of being haunted. And she's holding hands with someone she believes is her friend for comfort. And then when they turn the lights on, she sees that there's no one in the bed with her.
Right.
And that's always just stuck in my mind so much. But it never really, obviously I didn't know anything about her marriage. But I thought that, knowing that, it's just such a powerful metaphor for her marriage if you choose to read it that way. This idea of you think that there's someone in bed with you, comforting you. And then when you turn on the lights, you find out that you've been alone this whole time.
Exactly. And she says, God, whose hand was I holding? And I feel like that is also, part of these novels about houses, I feel, especially with Hill House, that are novels about marriage in a way, because, what is a more obvious symbol for marriage than a house? And in Hill House also, the house is a home that's been built by a father and a husband for his family, where things, of course, end up going terribly wrong for them there, and that's the tragedy of that house. But yeah, that scene where she suddenly is, she's convinced that she's holding someone's hand, she feels that she's holding someone's hand, and then it turns out to be not what she thinks it is. I think probably all of us have they have had the experience of, something happens that makes us think that our partner isn't quite the person we think they are, or, it shows a side that we haven't seen before. And, reminds us that other people are always basically unknowable in any, in so many important ways.
Right. Well, so you mentioned that you thought that Jackson had kind of been marginalized critically because she wrote so much about women and about domestic matters and things. Kind of what's been the trajectory of her critical appraisal, over the past few decades? Yeah,
well, at the time, critics definitely were really confused by her in general. Some of them admired, what we could call her serious novels, but disparaged her works about her household, the comic memoirs. And others, were just puzzled that the same person could write in these two very different genres. Some even criticized her for wasting her time writing about her family, writing these comic works. And needless to say that they were mostly male critics at the time. And so, I think because she didn't follow the traditional model of what a writer is supposed to be, especially because, she wasn't writing the quote-unquote great American novel as we've been taught to understand it, that she was marginalized during her life, as well as afterwards by, critics who essentially wrote her out of the canon because her works didn't fit into a recognizable mold. And it's really only over the past a decade or so, I would say, that serious, important academic criticism is being done of Jackson's work. And now, of course, all her novels are finally back in print, as well as her comic memoirs, and she's been deservedly praised for writing in both forms.
Yeah, it was interesting for me to read that she'd had this sort of lull in her level of awareness, because I mean, I hang out with so many horror writers, and among horror writers, she's always been held in very high esteem. I mean, you mentioned Neil Gaiman and Stephen King in the book. There's the Shirley Jackson Award. It just seems like that maybe the horror community has sort of like been appreciating her and sort of kept her memory alive in a way.
Right, and I think Stephen King especially has always been really active on her behalf and a big Shirley Jackson supporter. Of course, he has, I think, a whole chapter in his book Danse Macabre where he talks about Hill House, and especially its beautiful, beautiful first paragraph as kind of a paradigm for what fiction writing should be. And I believe at one point he was responsible for bringing some of Jackson's work back into print.
I mean, could you say maybe a little bit more about why did you decide to call the book Shirley Jackson: A Haunted Life?
Right. So yeah, it's called Shirley Jackson: A Rather Haunted Life.
A rather.
Yeah. And the quote actually comes from Roger Strauss, who was Shirley Jackson's first publisher, the publisher of the publishing house that was then called Farrar Straus. Now, of course, Farrar Straus and Giroux. And I struggled over whether to call the book this because Jackson actually really didn't like Roger Strauss very much, and I think would have been kind of chagrined to know that he got to have this this important say over her work. But it comes from an interview he gave where he described her as a rather haunted woman, and it struck me that this just was such an apt way to describe her because, of course, she was haunted. She had all these personal demons, her anxiety, her mental instability. We haven't really talked about this, but towards the end of her life, she was actually agoraphobic and for some time couldn't even leave her house. And of course, the demons that run rampant all over her work. So of course, she was haunted, but at the same time, my book does try to argue against the perception of Jackson as, just a horror writer, and to show that she had so many facets as a writer and as a person, and that her work was much more diverse, and also kind of much more to the point, and realistic about the situation for women than it's generally given credit for being. So in calling it A Rather Haunted Life, I kind of wanted to suggest that, yes, she was haunted, but, she wasn't extremely haunted. She was only rather haunted.
Yeah, and I mean, she died young, you say, right? Age 48.
That's right. That does seem young, doesn't it? Yeah, she died suddenly of a heart attack. She was very overweight and, drank and smoked heavily. Also, used some prescription drugs, and certainly all these habits contributed to her tragic early death. As I said, she was agoraphobic towards the end of her life, but which many people know. But what's lesser known is that in the last 6 months or so, she had made almost a complete recovery. And in fact, the spring before she died, she went on a big lecture tour of a number of colleges and universities, where she gave readings from the two novels that she was working on at the time that she died, one of which was published as Come Along With Me, as an unfinished novel, a comic novel about a woman who runs away from home and embarks on a new life. And then she was also writing at the same time a fantasy novel for children, kind of modeled on the Wizard of Oz books, which were a great favorite of hers. So when she died, she was arrested right in the middle of these two projects. So it's sad and frustrating to think of how much great work there might have been to come.
Right, especially you've said because her books were just getting better and better as she was going.
Yeah, I really do feel that she died at the peak of her creative powers. You've said, and I agree with you, that Hill House is your favorite of her novels. But many critics think that We Have Always Lived in the Castle is her best work. And it's definitely a very close second for me as her works go. It's a very spare, tight, just about perfect novel. And the work of a writer who had really learned how to kind of strip down and polish her sentences to perfection. It was one thing that her editor at the time, who was the legendary editor Pascal Cavici at Viking, one of the things that he most admired about her as a writer and enjoyed in working with her was that she was such a great editor of her own work.
I mean, there's actually a We Have Always Lived in the Castle film adaptation coming out. Are you excited about that?
Yeah, I've heard about that. I wish I had some inside knowledge to share with you. But I've just been following along in the news like everybody else. But I'm certainly very intrigued to see how that's going to come out.
I wanted to ask you about one of these blurbs that says that this book is a perfect marriage of biographer and subject. Do you think that you're the perfect person to write this book?
I hesitate to say anything quite so grandiose, but I definitely felt like I had a very deep sympathy with Shirley Jackson, and felt that way from the beginning of the project. That was important to me in writing this book. You often hear about biographers who fall out of love with their subjects, or become disenchanted and kind of disgruntled with them, and it seems like that can produce a very difficult writing experience, to say the least. And I'm really happy and grateful that I didn't have that experience of falling out of love. I remained for the whole 6 years. I remained as absorbed in Shirley Jackson's life, as ever. And, it just was, I found her to be an incredibly fascinating and congenial subject.
Right. I mean, it seems like in a lot of ways that you inhabit the same world she did. I mean, you mentioned that you're a mother, you're a writer, you live in the New York area, you publish in some of the same magazines that she and Stanley were publishing in. I mean, do you feel that you're sort of in that same world that she was in?
I mean, her world, in some ways, yes, of course. And, as a mother who's a professional writer, I do definitely experience some struggles that are similar to hers. I mean, on the other hand, though, writing this book really did give me an appreciation for how much things have changed. I'd say that one thing that has not changed for the better is the financial situation for writers. And one thing that just blew my mind was to see the kinds of fees that Jackson got for pieces in those days. They were fees that one would not be disappointed to get today. That's not adjusted for inflation. In the 50s or early 60s, she's getting $2,000 or $2,200 a pop for a magazine story, and in those days you could buy a small car with that amount of money. So,
and she did.
And she did. She loved to buy. She had a small collection of Mars Minors, the little British sports cars, and the idea, of course, that you could buy a car with your fee from a magazine piece these days quite foreign, I would say, to the vast majority of writers, of excepting perhaps those who are working at the absolute highest echelon. So while I looked on this aspect of the business with no small degree of nostalgia, or I guess false nostalgia, since it took place long before I was born, I would say that, obviously what has changed for the better is the roles that men and women are expected to play in marriage and in child rearing. Stanley Hyman, apparently, even for his age, was a strikingly uninvolved parent. And I'm happy to say that my own situation with my partners is quite different from that.
Yeah, he knows how to light the stove without your help.
I would say that he is more than capable of making his own coffee, which Stanley famously was apparently never able to do.
I mean, one other thing that really struck me is that so many of the letters that you quote in this book are letters where Shirley pours her heart out and then she never sent the letter. So
Yeah.
I don't know how many people besides you actually looked at these letters. Maybe nobody, I don't know. But, it seems like you know her in a very intimate way that maybe no one else ever did.
Well, there is something, very intimate about reading someone's personal papers like this. And I guess it's what makes so many people uncomfortable with the very idea of the biographer, who's often called a voyeur, or, a pathographer who searches for his subject's weaknesses and all that. There's no doubt that there is something kind of invasive about going through a person's private papers, the letters, the diaries, and all that stuff. But I guess you justify it by saying that you are really trying to understand what it was like to be this person. I spent 6 years, really trying to imagine myself inside Shirley Jackson's head. And it does feel like an incredibly intimate relationship. Of course, it's completely one-sided. It's the definition of the non-reciprocated love, I suppose. But at the same time, it's also it's very fulfilling in its own way.
Yeah. I also wanted to mention on Twitter today, I saw that you had there was this correction that was posted in the Boston
Exactly.
Globe.
The reports of my death were greatly exaggerated.
Yeah, so basically they accidentally printed that you had died at the age of 48 rather than Shirley Jackson had died at the age of 48.
Well, I'm relieved that I didn't actually read the version of the review that contained that bit of information, or it probably would have been quite disconcerting. But somebody tweeted back to me that this sounded like the setup for a Shirley Jackson story,
Yeah.
Which of course it does. It couldn't be more appropriate.
Yeah, I was going to say, I just want to reassure all our listeners that you are in fact alive. We are not doing this by seance or something.
We are not. I'm not speaking to you from beyond the grave, but from my home in Brooklyn.
Okay, so unfortunately we're pretty much out of time. So do you have any other projects you want to mention, or any final words or anything?
I as I said, I've spent so much time sort of trying to get into Shirley Jackson's head that I've been loath to jump right into another project. Right now, I'm still devoted to Jackson and to getting the word out about this book and about her work.
Well, so how are you planning to get the word out about it?
Well, I've got a small book tour going on where I'll be in Boston tomorrow, actually, and then in Washington and Baltimore the following week, and then in California, and then in New England. And so if anybody's interested, all the information is on my Facebook page and also my website at ruthfranklin.net.
All right, great. Yeah, and I really just strongly recommend people check out this biography. It's a long book, lots and lots of research, but it's a page turner. I just blew right through it. And just if you're interested in writing and, the lottery and Haunting of Hill House, I mean, it's just so much fascinating information in it. And so I think we're going to wrap things up there. So Ruth Franklin, thank you so much. The book, again, is called Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life. Remember to get that rather in there.
Thank you very much.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Ruth Franklin for joining us on the show. Big thanks as well to Penguin Random House for sponsoring today's show. check out the new book Spaceman, An Astronaut's Unlikely Journey to Unlock the Secrets of the Universe over at MikeMassimino.com. Special thanks as well to Jesse Colton, who just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time or fixed monthly contribution, you can do that via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. And I'd like to give a special thank you to Aaron Brumley, who just made a very generous contribution to the show via PayPal. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. Alright, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.